And there we read, there was a certain man from Ramathaim, a Zephite from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah. And he had two wives. One was called Hannah, and the other Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. And year after year, this man went up from his town to worship and sacrifice to the Lord Almighty at Shiloh. And whenever the day came for Elkanah to sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to his wife Peninnah and to all of her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her, and the Lord had closed her womb. Because the Lord had closed Hannah's womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. And this went on year after year. Once when they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on his chair by the doorpost of the Lord's house. And in her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. And she made a vow, saying, Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all of the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head. And as she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought she was drunk and said to her, How long are you going to stay drunk? Put away your wine. Not so, my lord, Hannah replied. I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief. Eli answered, Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him. She said, May your servant find favor in your eyes. And then she went her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. And early the next morning they arose and worshiped before the Lord, and then went back to their home at Ramah. Elkanah made love to his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. And so in the course of time, Hannah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, Because I asked the Lord for him. Well, last week, you may recall if you were with us, that I kind of ended my message by talking about my last night in a church back in Wooster, Ohio, more than 30 years ago. After 3 years of a wonderful youth ministry, I was saying goodbye to about 40 to 50 kids that night. That was a tough night. I had just been ordained. I was ready to go off to my first ordained church, and so it was tough to say goodbye to these kids that we had become so close to, Cindy and I. And so there were all these kids that we had known for 2 and 3 years, the seniors who were graduating, and was going down the line and hugging them all. And I came to this young man, just a 7th grader, just had started youth group like the month or two before that summer. And I got to him, and as I told you, when I hugged him, I broke down and I literally wept. And it wasn't until years later I told you that I came to realize why I mourned over this young man. Because he represented the harvest that I was never going to get to see come to fruition. I just had barely planted the seed in his life, and I was going to be leaving. And so in the 3+ decades since then, I told you I learned a great truth. And that great truth is that for hundreds and thousands of people over 35 years of ministry, I've been called by God to serve as sort of a spiritual way station in people's lives. And as Paul told us last week in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, in some people's lives I get to plant a seed. In other people's lives, somebody else plants, but I get to water that seed. In some other people's lives, someone else planted, someone else watered, but I get to tend and fertilize and kind of weed. And then in some people's lives, I get to be there for the harvest. But it's my job to faithfully do what God has called me to do, whatever one of those roles that may be. It's His job to make things grow. That's not my job. So that was a great spiritual truth that I had to learn over the years. But I want to share with you today now another great companion truth to that truth that I've discovered over 35 years of ministry. You know, as a young pastor, I came to terms with an inevitable, difficult thing in my life. I would get to see people come and go. I would get to see people move on. Every one of us has a spiritual quest in our life, and I would get to see some people die, and that was hard. I would see some people get called away because of jobs, and I would see other people move on to maybe another church. And as I faced that as a young pastor, I have to tell you, I wasn't always so graceful. Sometimes I would get angry about that. Sometimes I would get depressed. It was hard for me to accept, and so I would rail and I would rile against these realities, and I would ask God, why? Why is this happening? Because I would want to clutch so tightly to the people and the things in my life that I loved and I cherished so much. It was not easy for me to let these people go. You know, folks, we live in a constantly changing world, don't we? Things seem to be changing all the time around us. And right now, we all realize that our church is faced with a lot of change. Your pastor's going to be leaving. And what is going to be each of your own personal responses to this reality? Well, you know, in our lives, every day, there are things that we take for granted, things that provide us with a sense of security, things that provide us with a sense of stability in our life. The sun comes up in the morning and it goes down at night. The seasons, they change, they come and they go. And there are people and there are institutions all around us that are enduring. Things that seem to always be there, and without realizing it, we count on those things in our lives, don't we? Maybe it's our church. Maybe it's our pastor. It could be our doctor or our pharmacist. It could be our librarian or even our local grocer. You can think about the things and the people in your life that give you stability and security, that you take for granted, that always seem to be there. Let me give you an example from my own life. This spring, and then on into most of the summer until just a couple of weeks ago, as I would drive back and forth to work, you know, I would get on 63rd and I would head north and I would turn left onto 126th Avenue. And when I got down to the crossroads of 126th Avenue and 66th Streets, just out that way, there at the crossroads, every morning was a red-winged blackbird. And it sat up on the stop sign, just feet from my car. It would have its wings open a little bit and it would flutter, but my car would pull up and that blackbird would just sit there on that stop sign. Every day, he was there almost without fail. And it became the most interesting, marvelous thing in my life. As I would see that blackbird, I even gave him a name. I called him Chester. And Chester the blackbird was like clockwork. And I would text Cindy and say, Chester was there. As I would go to work or I would come home, Chester would be there at the crossroads, almost as a guardian or a greeter. And I came to love him, and I would laugh and grin when I would see Chester and look forward to seeing him. He became kind of like something in my life that was just there. And I could always count on that. But you know what? I also realized that the day would come when Chester, without a word of explanation or ever knowing where or why or what happened to him, that Chester would be gone. And that day came a couple of weeks ago. And I haven't seen Chester since. You know, I thought about Chester throughout the weeks and the months that he was there. And as I thought about Chester, Chester kind of became for me a metaphor for something important that I think we all deal with in our lives, something that's bigger. What should be our perspective towards those times when the Chesters of our lives are no longer there anymore? Well, let's think about a guy in the Bible. His name was Jonah. Let's remember the story of Jonah. Jonah was called by God to go and to preach to a bunch of pagan people in a far-off city called Nineveh. But as you'll recall, Jonah didn't want to do that, so he hopped on a boat to try to run away from God to head towards a town named Tarshish. But as he was on that boat, God, in his sovereignty, said, Jonah, you are going to do what I've asked of you to do. And so God sent a storm, and so the sailors on the boat wondered where the storm came from, and Jonah finally said, God caused this storm. He's sending me a message. And so Jonah said, you need to throw me overboard. The sailors tried to do everything they could to prevent that, but eventually they had to throw Jonah overboard. And we all know what happened to Jonah, right? Some might say a whale, some might say a big fish, but either way, Jonah gets swallowed, and the whale takes him to where he needs to be and spits him out on the land. And I can't begin to imagine what Jonah must have looked like, being in the belly of that great beast for that long of a time, 3 days and 3 nights, kind of like someone else that was in a tomb, who Jesus made a point about that in the New Testament. And so soggy and bleached white or whatever he was, Jonah had to go into that great city of Nineveh, and he had to preach to all of those pagan people. He does what the Lord asks of him, and what happens? The king and all the people put on sackcloth and ashes, and they repent, and there's a great revival. Probably the greatest revival in all of history happens in Nineveh. No preacher had a greater response than Jonah ever received. 120,000 people get saved. But then Jonah, who didn't want to go and do this in the first place, when all these people repent, he feels sorry for himself. And so kind of like, Fred Sanford, you remember him, he would always say, take me, Elizabeth, I'm coming to meet you now. What does Jonah do? He feels sorry for himself. He goes outside of town and he sits down. And as he's sitting there feeling all sorry for himself, he said, God, I knew that you were a God who is abundant to forgive and compassionate. And exactly this is what I thought was going to happen. Jonah's kind of got his priorities out of whack. And so we pick up the story at the end of Jonah, and it says, Jonah went out and he sat down at a place east of the city. And he sat there waiting to see what would happen to the city. And the Lord God provided a vine. It's kind of like a bush. And he made it grow up over Jonah to give shade for his head, to ease his discomfort. And Jonah was very happy about the vine. But then at dawn the next day, God provided a worm, which chewed the vine so that it withered. And when the sun rose, God provided a scorching east wind, and the sun blazed on Jonah's head so that he grew faint. He wanted to die, and he said, "It would be better for me to die than to live. Take me, Lord, I'm coming to you, Elizabeth." But God said to Jonah, "Do you have a right to be angry about this vine?" "I do," he said. "I am angry enough to die." But the Lord said, "You have been concerned about this vine, though you did not tend it or make it grow. It sprung up overnight, it died overnight, but Nineveh has more than 120,000 people who cannot tell their right hand from their left, and many cattle as well. Should I not be concerned about this great city?" Jonah? So Jonah, this shrub pops up and the worm comes and withers it, and Jonah's perspective is what? He wants to die. And so God reminds Jonah, "You did nothing to make this bush grow. You didn't tend it or anything like that. I gave this bush to you as a gift." And Jonah arrogantly misses a vital perspective in life. And what is that perspective? All things come from God. They do not belong to us. Jonah thought his life belonged to him, that he could do whatever he wanted with his life. And it so crowded out his perspective that he was not even able to see that God had a bigger purpose and a plan than his little thoughts and dreams that would lead to the saving of tens and hundreds of thousands of people's lives. He thought that bush belonged to him. God had to remind him, "I gave you that bush. I can do what I want with that bush. I can cause it to rise up. I can cause a worm to eat it and for it to wither." Where is your perspective, Jonah? Well, the Bible reminds us again and again that all things come from God. In the book of James chapter 1, James says in the 17th verse, "Every good and perfect gift is from above. It comes down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows." David the psalmist writes in Psalm 24 verse 1, "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it." How many of you remember the great spiritual musical Godspell? Remember the song in Godspell? "All good gifts around us are sent from heaven above. So thank the Lord for all his love." Yeah. So what should be our perspective according to this truth? Well, we get to see different people in the Bible who have different perspectives regarding this reality. We think about the parable that Jesus told in Luke chapter 12. And he says, "The ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. And so he thought to himself, 'What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops.' And then he said, 'This is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones. And there I will store all of my grain and my goods. And I'll say to myself, Self, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life, be easy, eat, drink, and be merry.' But then God said to him, 'You fool, this very night, your life will be required of you. And then, who will get what you have prepared for yourself? All good gifts around us are sent from heaven above. The earth is the Lord's, and everything in it. This guy, the rich fool, he missed that reality. He thought that everything he had belonged to himself. So, tear down barns, build bigger barns, eat, drink, and be merry, right? Tonight, your very life will be required of you. He forgot that all things belong to God. Everything we have is a gift. Everything belongs to the Lord and not to ourselves. So this guy didn't get it. How about a guy who did get it? Let's think about our friend Job. Remember what happened to Job? Everything was taken away from him. His family, his health, all of his stuff, like that, it was gone. And what was Job's perspective regarding all this? We read about it in the book of Job, chapter 1, verse 21. What did he say? He said, "The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Job's perspective was spot on. He recognized that nothing belonged to him, that everything belonged to the Lord. So we think about the Chesters. We think about Jonah's bush. These are just gifts that God gives us. Chester's really a pretty small thing. He's a red-winged blackbird that I got to see every day. Yet I still mourn over Chester being gone. I counted on him. I depended on him. It was so good to see him every day. Well, let's think about something a lot bigger. Let's think about a human being. And what I'm about to share with you is highly personal, and yet I'm sure it's going to be very funny to you. You'll get a chuckle out of it. I want to talk about me and LeBron James. When Cindy and I came to Akron, Ohio in 1990, LeBron was 5 years old and living in the projects there in Akron. We were there for 13 years. LeBron was 5 when we started. He was 18 when we left, the year he was drafted into the NBA. And as things began to progress over his childhood, you began to hear about this kid in Akron. And as he got into middle school and then onto high school, and then he was on the cover of Sports Illustrated, it began to be clear that this kid was something special. So, I had people that lived from my congregation down in the projects around where LeBron and his mother Gloria lived. And sometimes in high school, LeBron would come up to our kids' high school in Talmadge because he had a cousin there. But you were always hearing about LeBron. And so the year we left, LeBron, of course, went into the NBA draft as a high schooler and was drafted to the Cleveland Cavaliers. He went to my team, the Cleveland Cavaliers, and so you got to watch this kid develop, and you began to realize that this guy may just be a once-in-a-generation kind of a player. How many of you who are from around here or Chicago were Chicago Bulls fans? And how many of you can say that it was a privilege for the years that Michael Jordan was in Chicago to just be a part of that? That was something special, wasn't it? Michael Jordan. Some say that LeBron James is, some will not, but some will say he is the closest thing since then to Michael Jordan. Well, we got to watch LeBron, and it was fantastic. And then 8 years ago, My wife and I were in a national park out west, and the day of the decision came. And I remember I asked the waiter, because I had been in the park out of commission, have you heard what was the decision LeBron made? And he said, you haven't heard? I said, no, I've been out of commission. He says, LeBron is going to Miami. This guy was from Miami, so he kind of rubbed it in. He didn't get a tip that night from me. I was not happy. Literally, tears rolled down my face. My jaw dropped open. And I was angry. I was depressed. I'll have to tell you that I asked a lot of questions. You know, it was kind of like the Hee Haw song, you know, where are you tonight? Why did you leave me here all alone? I searched the world over and thought I found true love. You met another and you was gone. So, why did you leave me, LeBron? How could you do this to me? You know, I had a LeBron jersey. And when we went down to Florida to visit Cindy's sister and husband, I gave him the LeBron jersey. I said, here, I don't want this anymore. I was in grief. I gave him the LeBron jersey, and so guess what? I had to buy another one. But 4 years ago, LeBron came back. All was forgiven. There's been 4 years in a row of going to the NBA Finals. 1 year, Cleveland actually won it after 50 years of no championships. You people from Detroit, you people from Chicago, you don't know anything about suffering. People in Cleveland, the mistake by the lake, right? And so LeBron came back, and we were so happy. We won a crown. And then this summer came. Free agency. The Los Angeles Lakers. LeBron is gone again. But you know what? My perspective has changed. Maybe I've grown up a little bit with some time. Because I realized, like Chester, LeBron doesn't belong to me. He doesn't know me from Adam. He doesn't owe me nothing. It was a gift from God for 12 years to have this guy on our team, to watch him play. He was not mine to possess. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away, right? Blessed be the name of the Lord. So it raises a question. How do we hold on to the things that we love and we cherish in life? Tightly or lightly? Today in our lesson, we got to hear the story of a beautiful, godly woman named Hannah. And she was barren. She had no children. And she cried out to God, and she made a vow to God, and she said, you know, if you will give me a child, I will give him back to you. And so we pick up the story after the facts of what we read today. And it says, after he was weaned, probably around 3 years of age, she took the boy, Samuel, with her, and she offered up a sacrifice. And when the bull had been slaughtered, she brought the boy to Eli the priest, and she said to him, as surely as you live, my Lord, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life he will be given over to the Lord. And he worshiped the Lord there. So she surrenders the thing that she loves most to the Lord, and she recognizes this boy is not mine. He belongs to God. Well, you know, there's a beautiful little passage in the Psalms, Psalm 37, verse 4. It says, delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. And what is the command that is associated with being given the desires of your heart? It's delighting yourself. And in the Bible, the word for delight means soft, pliable, moldable, teachable. You see, Hannah had that kind of a spirit that was humble, that surrendered to the Lord and to His will, so that she could hold on to the thing that she loved the most tightly? No, but lightly. You know, I've been thinking a lot about this in my own life. I've been thinking about God's pruning, His refining, His winnowing, His molding over the years of my life. I've come to realize that my perspective on a lot of things have changed, and I begin to hear more and more God's voice say, you know, Jeff, nothing belongs to you. You're just a steward. You're a caretaker. You don't own anything. Everything I give you is just on loan to you. You're not an owner. You're a loaner, a borrower. The earth is the Lord's and all that is in it. So how does this truth show up in our lives? Do we have this kind of a perspective? Or are we more like Jonah and that rich fool? Or are we more like Job and Hannah? Because it applies to so many areas of our lives. It applies to our children. The Lord took our son through a twist of fate, Jordan, out to the west coast. He was supposed to stay here, but he's out there. The Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. He is not ours. He belongs to God. And this perspective, it'll show up in just about everything in your life. And it doesn't mean that you have to love the things that you love any less. It means, do you have that perspective? Are you an owner or a loaner? Everything that I have is at His disposal. The Chesters, the LeBrons, my kids, my life, my church, everything. And folks, amidst this transition, I want to thank you for your very wise and kind and gracious response to Cindy and I as we are preparing to move with where the Lord is calling us, because you get it. You get it. We don't belong to you or to any other church. We belong to the Lord. All things are gifts from God. So hold on to them lightly. Let's pray. Father, truly all good gifts come from you, from the Father of lights. We give you thanks for the gifts that you give us. Give us the perspective, like Job, like Hannah, to trust you, to make all things at your disposal. For when you might call upon them, they are there for your use. We give you thanks in Jesus' name.